Well, I suppose it was only a matter of time before I'd have to make this video, huh? Especially considering I already covered one half of Chris Chan's infamous parents. In the tragic story of the life of Christian Weston Chandler, there are many names from different points on the spectrum of good and bad influences in Chris's life. While it is easy to just accept his story as something simple, one of failure by his surroundings and then of himself, the people around Chris ultimately did have an impact on the way that Chris acted. The people closest to him had the largest amount of influence and of course made the biggest changes to his life. This video is a broad overview of the story of Barbara Chandler, based on information gathered by astute internet denizens who are just a little too intrigued by the Chandler family history. The year is 1941, October 1st. It's another day in Red Oak, Virginia, and a loving couple brought a young girl into the world who they'd name Barbara Ann Weston. Barbara's parents were Joseph Otto Joe Weston and Carrie Edna Wynn. They married years before in the February of 1927. They'd have many children together, but they graced the world with this bundle of joy that is Barbara. She was the fifth out of 8 children, so it's safe to assume their house was pretty packed. Despite the packed family, Barbara's life was pretty simple. She grew up in a farming household and the money was understandably very tight, so she had to put in a fair day's work at a very young age. She took to sewing her own clothes, whether it to fix snags or tears or to create entire new articles of clothing. She was able to do housework and probably did outdoor work too, but we'll see later that she likely complained the entire time that she did it. Despite their busy work schedule, she and her family did go to church on Sundays to practice some leisurely God-fearing. They of course had to fulfill their religious obligations and weekly entertainment of hellfire and brimstone. Joseph was a hard-working man, doing what he had to do to provide for his family and his wife who he married while she was still underage, but that's neither here nor there. One of the earliest memories Barbara recalled of her father was one where she was about 2 years old. She witnessed her father covered in silver paint as he had just fallen off of the roof of their house while he was trying to paint it, somehow miraculously surviving. While I'm impressed that Joe was able to take such a steep fall, I'm curious as to how she is able to remember something so clearly from when she was just 2 years old. Tough questions for another day, I suppose. Regardless of everything, she grew older and pushed through the years and many arduous experiences in school. Not much is known about her childhood, but we are fortunate enough to have some insight into her academic adventures at Randolph Henry High School. She participated in many extracurricular activities. She was in Spanish club, she was a typist for the school yearbook, she was treasurer for the school's chapter of Future Homemakers of America, and a reporter for the school's bus patrol. She was even known for her perfect attendance record from sophomore to senior year. She was apparently competent enough to land 2 boyfriends during her time in school. And bear with me here because I know talking about competence regarding a Virginian seems like a waste of time. One of these boyfriends was Tom Ashby, who later married Barb's younger sister, Harriet. Tom was about a year or so younger than Barb, and her interactions with him caused quite a bit of animosity with her folks, as she alienated herself from her immediate family while she was pursuing Tom. She did, however, allegedly lose her virginity to Tom, but this has never been properly confirmed, at least from what I've read. On one hand, her future son claimed that she had slept with Tom when they were both in high school, but in a letter from the 10th of May 2022, he stated that Barb never bumped uglies with any of her sweethearts, but rather her sisters accused her of doing so. To be fair, in a state like Virginia, I think the expectation for sexual deviation is probably at least a little reasonable. Barb eventually completed high school in 1960. After graduating, she moved away from Red Oak and hit the road in hopes of achieving her dreams, whatever those might have been, and maybe settling down with a family when the time is right. She broke off her relationship with Tom, who probably had to carefully tend to his aching heart. Upon her departure, her dastardly family began spreading rumors about her, calling her nasty things like a slut and whatever else while she was away. These rumors did eventually cause her mother to disown her, which is unfortunate. Barb would always have a shaky relationship with her blood, as she never seemed to quite align with their beliefs, but given their expectations of her, perhaps their vision was a bit skewed. She eventually moved to Richmond, Virginia. The college she attended has never actually been verified, but we do know she majored in accounting and numbers. At least that is what Chris Chan said, so take that as you will. A common theory is that she attended Wake Forest College, as this is where her eventual first husband was studying at the time. The reasoning for this theory is that we know Barb dropped out of schooling in 1961, which is the exact same year that the man graduated and married her. It is worth noting, however, that both marriage certificates from her last 2 marriages later in her life do not suggest she actually ever finished any amount of college. This is likely just another unusual fib drip-fed from the Chandler household. Barb's residence in Richmond ranged from 1961 to 1980. As far as historians have been able to put together, she appears to have been with 5 men, not including her final husband. Out of the 6 individuals, only 3 of these men are known by name. The first one, whose identity is somewhat shrouded in mystery, had a child with Barb in 1963. The child's name was Cole Smithy, but Cole's genesis is a complicated thing to break down, as Barb consistently lied to Cole about the identity of his sperm donor, or father in layman's terms. Cole has claimed that she has a, quote, proclivity to isolate herself via scurrilous males, whatever the hell that means. Scurrilous means making or spreading scandalous claims about someone with the intention of damaging their reputation, so perhaps he should have just said that she had a proclivity for promiscuity, but Cole has a history of using words incorrectly, so hey, it happens. According to the records unearthed by dedicated historians, Barb married a man named Rand Coleman Yeats on June 17, 1961. Yeats was the man who attended Wake Forest College at the same time that Barb was in school. Rand graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree sometime before April 1961, just a few short months before he and Barb would tie the knot. The couple didn't last terribly long, as they were divorced on the 15th of May 1963, during which she was pregnant with Cole. She claimed that Rand deserted her on the 28th of April 1962, but we have no confirmation of this either. One interesting thing, though, is that their decree lists there being 0 children, but this document may have not taken unborn children into account. Cole was born on the 24th of July 1963. Yeats would periodically reappear in Cole's life, being introduced as some sort of friend of the family. Cole later hired a private detective in hopes of finding the true identity of his actual father. He even inquired about his dad in a phone call to Barb, but she hung up on him when he began hitting her with the hard questions. Yeats would go on to remarry later in his life and died at the ripe age of 67 on the 6th of June 2007. His obituary does not mention Cole or Barb, so this is all up in the air, but I'm in the camp of believing that they're related. Adds more spice to the story if nothing else. Hell, Cole's name is likely just taken from Rand's middle name. It just makes sense, you know? Despite the evidence that stacks up against her claims, Barb insists that Cole's actual father is Jack Dale Smithy, who she claims that she was once married to. This, however, is unlikely as Cole was unable to find a marriage license or any sort of record about their wedding. Typically, lots of photos are taken at weddings, but he couldn't even find a single picture. Historians have also been seemingly unsuccessful at locating genuine evidence. Barb, however, claimed that the wedding was quite extravagant, but for a Virginian wedding, that likely means the venue had running water. In 1995, a good friend of Cole, Ted Rall, who was a syndicated cartoonist, made a post online asking for assistance in gaining information related to the location of Jack Dale Smithy. The post stated that Smithy was living in Richmond in 1963, which of course is the year that Cole was born, and that he was a merchant marine. He also worked as a trucker for a bit but disappeared after 1964. The private detective that Cole hired did manage to locate Jack in Sarasota, Florida. Regardless of any tangible evidence to assist her claims, newspaper articles indicate that Barb was using the surname Smithy until she married another man in 1968. In the middle of 2021, when Chris asked Barb about her relationship with Jack Smithy, he said, quote, "Short story of it is that Jack and Barbie went out, sexed up, knocked her up, then he hit the road. Was not in it to be a daddy. The life on the open road called out to him more." He also stated that there were no photos of Jack in their home, which is possibly suspicious. One might assume that she may have let go of photos from previous marriages, but she did have photos of her other spouses, so who really knows? Continuing on with Barb's list of spouses, the next one up was Walter Jerome Jerry Harmon Jr. Without being too vulgar right away, let me just say, Barb sucked at picking her lovers back then. According to Cole, he was unable to find a marriage certificate for his mother's union. However, there is a divorce record stating that Jerry and Barb got married on the 18th of June in 1968 in Washington, D.C. They divorced some years later on the 7th of January 1980, after about a year of being apart. This was about 3 weeks before her next husband after Jerry would divorce his wife. Jerry was allegedly very abusive towards Cole. During an email correspondence with his half-brother in 2007, Cole stated, "I grew up in an abusive household with Barbara and my former stepfather Jerry, where physical and mental punishments ran the gambit from bare-ass beatings to cold showers to bizarre scenarios acted out with glee by 2 deeply neurotic adults. Even at a very young age, I knew that they would abandon me. They were both irresponsible and incompetent parents who exposed me to traumas that I would rather not remember." On Cole's Film Critic blog, he created an article titled Saturday Night Special where he broke down information regarding Jerry and his relationship with Barbara. Turns out Jerry was a professional magician. Out of all of the possible careers that he could have had, it had to be a fucking magician, right? He and Barb lived in an apartment near the campus of Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond in the early 1970s. Jerry also left a gun in his nightstand drawer, which Cole would play with because of his terribly absent parental figures. One night, when Jerry was out pounding some other backwoods cooch while Barb was at home ignoring Cole, an intruder attempted to break into the apartment. Barb had to use the aforementioned weapon to scare them off. Instead of just pointing it at the intruder, shooter. She fired it, causing the shot to ricochet and almost hit Cole. The bullet supposedly hit the wall just behind Cole's head. The validity of this claim may be questionable, however, as Cole has since removed the article from his blog. Unfortunately, most of what we know about Jerry comes from Cole, so his recollections may be a touch biased. He posted another article after the last, titled Operation Snowball, My First Career in Show Business, where Cole detailed the now defunct Harmon family business of being an annual traveling magic show. The target audience appeared to be patients at mental hospitals during Christmas time from 1967 to 76. The group's happy name was King Karnak, Barbie, and Cole. Jerry's next wife, Rose Lenora Lotz, started as an assistant for the King Karnak show, which may indicate that Jerry was just as promiscuous as his current wife. Kind of ironic, I'd say. But that is unfortunately all we know about Jerry. That's fine though, because we get to talk about the big man himself, Mr. C. Barb's next and final husband was the late and great Robert Franklin Chandler Jr. The two met one fateful night at Maddie's Pub in Richmond in 1979. Barb and her friends were at the bar, most likely looking for some stiff meat to sit on and maybe a tricky venereal disease to catch. Bob was impressing the crowds with his dulcet tones, singing the night away. In a haze of drunken fervor, Barb set her sights on Bob and his titillating tallywhacker, chasing him down the hall and making him swoon. They married the following year in 1980. Chris claimed that, quote, Barbara, in her own words, married him because he owned a house, which is pretty damn shallow. Bob would move around a fair bit, but eventually they settled in Ruckersville, Virginia, the hellhole that would house most of the tale of Chris Chan. While married to Bob, Barb worked as a financial secretary for several companies. The biggest organization that employed her was VEPCO, or rather Dominion Energy, which is a power company. She also worked for First North American National Bank. The two would make their relationship work despite their jobs and the distance between home. By September 1993, Bob and Chris had moved to Chesterfield County, which is near Richmond, so Chris could attend a more reputable public school. Barb, however, stayed behind in Ruckersville, where she would work until retirement. She did visit Bob and Chris every week, despite the distance. After her retirement in 1996, Barb moved to Chesterfield with her family. At least there's some sense of familial togetherness in this story. Once Bob and Barb were both properly retired, they moved back to Ruckersville in 2000 until the nasty debacle of 2021, but we'll touch on that a bit more later. Barb began hoarding and ruining the house, alongside Chris's nonsensical shenanigans. Bob was powerless against his son's mighty autism and Barb's profound laziness. As such, the couple drifted apart emotionally, at least that's what Chris claims anyway. They both had been sleeping in separate rooms by the mid-2000s. This would persist until Bob passed away on the 6th of December 2011, leaving Barb a widow and Chris without a father to disappoint. Since we're talking about her history and her lovers, maybe it's time we talk about the last person she would ever be intimate with, her son, Christian. Barb manipulated every person she was closest to. This means Bob, Cole, and of course the creator of Sonichu and Rosechu. For example, Barb's favorite weapon against her immediate family was threats of self-harm. In 2011, Chris wanted to go to MagFest, a convention for dorks and dweebs who leave the safety of their dimly lit bedrooms only a handful of times a year. Chris wanted to go because he thought this could be an opportunity for him to lose that darned virginity of his. But unfortunately, he failed to allocate the funds necessary for a hotel room. His plan after that was to sleep in his car. Barb didn't like that idea, pointing out the crime risk and chilly temperatures. And of course, she threatened to lock him out of the house and then claimed she'd just grab her shit and leave. Just up and leave, just like that. She later told Chris she wanted to die. This hurt Chris's delicate feelings and he just gave up, running back to his room to bawl his eyes out. A quote from Chris reads, "And he told me of Mom saying she was going to pack up and leave the house. Then I ran downstairs, finding her on the couch. She was so miserable and sad. She talked of wanting to die. You don't even have to change my clothes. You can just bury me in what I have on. I was so sad and crying and so sorry for the way I misbehaved. We hugged and made up a bit." She did make it up to him later, with Chris stating, "My mom treated me to half payment of a copy of DC Universe Online to make up for not allowing me to go. Even after that, I feel low as shit." At one point, the hoarding problem was already beyond out of control, which worried Bob because the health department of Greene County could possibly get on their case soon, especially considering how often Chris had overshared things on the internet. When the father-son duo sat down with Barb and tried to explain the situation to her, she pulled the same lovely tactic she always did, responding by threatening to self-harm. But there's more. During the Ivy saga, Chris was planning a trip up to Boston University to see his internet girlfriend. At this time, he was being a thieving little shit and stealing money from his parents. He'd been using his parents' credit cards for his PlayStation Network expenses and had also been stealing change from Barb's purse. When she learned of this, she, you guessed it, threatened to end Hero yet again. She was justified in being upset, but such a response is ridiculous. Moving forward, she is old-fashioned, so take that however you will. She didn't exactly respond positively to Chris becoming a tomgirl. She tried to prevent Chris's behavior, attempting to stop him from wearing dresses and makeup by suggesting that this would eventually make him kill her. Yes, you heard that right. The logic escapes me as well. She then made him sit down and cut his hair by force. She also tried to pay Chris to not wear women's clothing, and she threatened to kill him when Chris started exploring his sexuality. What a loving and understanding household. Barb as a whole was quite cold to the people closest to her, as she would often stop doing things the moment she felt even slightly inconvenienced. When the Chandler family moved back to Ruckersville in 2000, Barb actually offered to do something for once, opting to make a spaghetti dinner for Bob and Chris. Chris said he didn't feel like eating spaghetti that night, and for whatever reason this really fucking angered Barb. She decided she was never going to slave over the stove for her husband or son ever again, as she was so scorned by her ungrateful family. Chris would later apologize to her for not wanting to eat spaghetti in 2000. Not even joking. She'd always use her power over Chris to get what she wanted. Another way she'd do that is by using her old age as a weapon. She would suggest that dealing with Chris and his bullshit was going to give her a heart attack, which is a fair thing to worry about, all things considered. However, she knew that Chris was paranoid about losing her, so she would use this to make him panic about her heart stopping. This shook him so badly that if he called her phone while he was out and about and she didn't pick up, he'd call 911. She had inadvertently created a bigger problem, and now she was causing her clueless dolt to waste vital time belonging to emergency services. Additionally, on October 28, 2011, Barb and Chris were busted for assault and battery at the game place. The duo had hoped to discuss the terms of Chris's current ban from the store, as the previous owner was out on his ass due to sexual abuse charges. Unsurprisingly, things didn't go as Chris had initially planned, and he and his mother proceeded to make a scene. This understandably led to law enforcement arriving at the store. Chris was panicked about Barb's health after she was subdued by the police, as she had just assaulted an officer while trying to defend Chris. In an email, he said, quote, "My mother fought the police in my defense, and she was handcuffed and I was emotionally distraught. I screamed and screamed and screamed until an ambulance came for my mother to take her to UVA hospital. She was okay, but her blood pressure was high. I prayed a lot to Jesus for my release and safe return home with my mother, and I banged the cell door with both my feet lying in a folding mattress on the floor to get those bastards to let me see and talk to my mother. Only after seeing my mother in her suit pass by my second cell, I did start to calm down. I was really worried about my mother and her health. She needed me, and I needed her." This all would have been avoided if she just didn't add fuel to the already burning inferno. She knew just how reactive her son is, and she decided to make matters worse, but both of them should have just stayed home that day. She seemed to fear the possibility of Chris getting into legal trouble, like you would expect from a doting mother. However, this likely stems from her blatant need to be taken care of. She is otherwise incapable of taking care of herself, as she has demonstrated repeatedly through her own actions. This paranoia of potential government-level autistic kicking would eventually lead to her losing her personal assistant drove her mad, and she just couldn't afford to let that happen. Without Chris, who was gonna wipe her ass? What is interesting about her neglectful nature is how hypocritical her behavior is on multiple occasions. There were many instances where she would attempt to shield Chris from feeling bad about anything ever. Chris was taught to not recognize his shortcomings or failures, which allowed him to build an unwarranted bravado, a seemingly unstoppable ego, because he could do no wrong, except for the times when he would make her throw a fit and then she would threaten to harm herself. But, you know. The pattern is impossible to deny, which likely confused Chris, who already had social issues. When she wasn't berating him or wearing him down, she'd shower him in affection into adulthood, almost as if he was still an infant. She'd tell him how handsome he was, and that the reason he'd blank out mentally is because he's, quote, a creative genius and simply overwhelmed by having so many creative ideas. But when Chris started expressing interest in getting creative with his outfits, like wearing women's clothing and coming out as a tomgirl, she'd ridicule him and remind him that she didn't raise a daughter and that tomgirls aren't real. Because of Barb's profuse laziness, she'd make Chris act as a servant for her. According to the man in the pickle suit, Barb would scream for Chris from across the other side of the house, and our favorite autistic would rush to his mother's aid. Chris would clean up the shitty dog pads, run errands to get her things like sandwiches at midnight, he'd load groceries into the car and then bring them inside the house. You'd be fine in assuming that she offloaded the work onto him because of the age difference, but like we discussed before, she only did things if she wanted to. If she felt scorned, you'd be on your own. Chris was so afraid of his mother that he would let her walk all over him despite how weak and frail she actually was. Chris could have easily put his foot down and stood his ground, but he didn't want to disappoint her. She had him right where she wanted him. Her neglectful behavior was sometimes a joint effort with her husband. According to Cole, when Chris was very young, she and Bob left Chris with the abusive babysitter every day while they went out drinking. This babysitter allegedly locked Chris in a room filled with toys because she was mad at him, and this supposedly traumatized Chris to the point of making him not talk for 6 years. Chris blames his autism on this event, but that is simply impossible. His parents preferred to drink while their son was showing early signs of autism. Perhaps if they put down the bottle, they could have learned of it earlier. Bob passed away in 2011, as she had one less person to dump her emotional baggage onto. So, by 2013, she demanded Chris sleep closer to her because she was lonely. She slept on the first floor while Chris's bedroom was on the second level, and it was hard to hear her screams for attention from that distance. Chris initially tried to set up his own defenses and sleep by himself, but she flipped the fuck out and threw a temper tantrum, smashing things in his room and knocking things over, simply because her son wanted to sleep like a normal person. Given his antics, she should have just appreciated that he was actually wanting to do something normal for once. As time would pass, so would many sagas, and eventually the two found themselves in the most devastating saga yet, the financial crisis. She had become obsessed with money, at least according to Chris. Anytime Chris would sell one of his possessions, like a collectible toy, she would want a portion of the money, pestering him for a taste of the profits. This eventually caused Chris to dread being around her because she would inevitably bring up the finances. However, this may have been some kind of exaggeration by Chris because they were both severely in debt. Moving forward, another strange thing about her interactions with Chris was how touchy-feely she was. According to the man in the pickle suit, when observing Chris and Barb during a court hearing in 2016, Chris and Barb were a little too physically intimate. Chris could be seen rubbing her shoulders and holding her close, as if he's trying his hardest to court his own mother. How ironic considering what would happen later, right? Another testimony comes from Arthur Spatchcock. He stated that after the Chandler house fire in 2014, Chris and Barb were living in a temporary place while their house was being renovated. They had to share a bed, wherein Barb wanted Chris to spoon with her, just like how I mentioned she wanted to sleep closer to him before. It was never revealed whether or not Chris was the big or little spoon, but Barb was unimpressed either way. She threw one of her iconic shit fits and bullied Chris into buying a mattress for himself with his own money. She sorta did him a favor, come to think of it, making him stand his ground and whatnot, at the expense of making him spoon with her for a bit. Barb's snuggle struggles with Chris began when Bob was still alive, and he was fully aware of it. But due to Bob being worn down to a nub by his wife, he couldn't stop her from damaging their son further. In August of 2016, Chris confessed to having wet dreams about his own mother. Chris notably started to refer to Barb as dear or darling, which is something he normally reserved for his potential sweethearts. At an April 2018 Twitch stream, Chris got his mother to reluctantly say, "Turn me loose, you silly goose," after hugging. Chris didn't like how she said it, saying, "You used to do that more flirtingly." What could this possibly mean? In June of 2021, Chris made a post to Facebook claiming that he and Barb never slept in the same bed. Same room, different furniture. He totally wasn't lying, right? And before we move on to the next part, I should preface that it's going to get really bad. The next thing we're going to be talking about is pretty repulsive, so if you've got a weak stomach, I'd turn away. Chris was just getting more sexually frustrated, and tugging on his pickle just wasn't doing the trick anymore. He began to exercise his sexual struggles with his mother by manipulating her into having sex with him. This became a recurring problem, happening as frequently as every 3 days. He would admit to this in a call where he described all of the terrible things he did with her and to her. There were also some leaked chats that Chris had with some other people, but I gotta be honest with you, they're too disgusting to get into. During this ordeal, Chris would vague post about it online, calling Barb his sweetheart over 50. This information was leaked by the Sutress, and of course the news spread like wildfire. Barbara's behavior is obviously very erratic and unstable, and these negatives ultimately passed on to Chris. Her selfish actions, like being solely focused on her own well-being and her desire to shift the blame onto others, is mimed by her son, as the same exact nonsense can be seen from Chris many times throughout his story. This was inevitably going to happen. Chris may be her favorite child when compared to Cole, but that certainly doesn't mean that she was going to treat him any better, if at all. Her hoarding of crap also passed on to her son. Chris called her a pack rat, which might have been an understatement. There were allegedly piles of clothes as tall as a person in their house, getting so bad to the point of making it seem like moving through the house was actually navigating a labyrinth. By 2009, the living room was totally unusable. She'd take her happy ass to Goodwill, load up on secondhand crap, and just drop it wherever she saw fit. Hell, the hoarding contributed to Bob's death, as he was quarantined for bug bites after being admitted to the hospital, just a short while before his passing. These bugs likely wouldn't have been in the house if it were clean and not full of shit. By 2013, the hoarding had more or less rendered several rooms of the house completely inaccessible, kinda defeating the purpose of having such a large place. There were piles of toys and clothes and boxes and plastic containers and trash stacked damn near the height of the ceiling. It should go without saying that this wasn't just a major hygiene and health hazard, but also ample kindling for a house fire, if that were to happen. And of course it did. On January 10th, 2014, Chris attempted to brew coffee in the Chandler bathroom, because of course the kitchen was inaccessible. Once the fire started, it spread fast thanks to the mounds of garbage lying around, and the inferno took the life of one of the many neglected Chandler cats. At least the cat got away from them somehow. Is that too much? Oh well. The house needed repairs after the disastrous pot of coffee, and Barb and Chris were going to need a place to bunker down for a while. Barb let her out-of-control hoarding nature take over during the salvaging process, holding on to basically anything that she believed was worth keeping, although a majority of it all was damaged by water, smoke, and, well, fire. Fire seems to be pretty good at destroying things. Chris confirmed this in April 2017, as he confirmed the current state of the laundry room was less than accessible, and there were about 20 to 40 bags of dirty, damaged clothes and some dirty, crapped briefs. For a large chunk of the story of Chris, Barb was morbidly obese. There's a photo of her that was quite popular among Chris's onlookers, which led her to getting the name Snorlax, a creature from the Pokemon franchise that is known for being fat and sleeping a lot. She'd often be at home eating, napping, avoiding chores, skipping church, and watching game shows. Which I'm not gonna lie, that sounds like the ideal way to live. Pretty badass, I'd say. She did appear to have lost weight by 2012, as Chris took a photo of her at a 2012 Mythbusters tour stop in Washington, D.C. Her weight continued to drop through the years. This was likely from her lack of exercise and of course her aging, with the former possibly drastically affecting her diet. Chris tried to cash in on the popular Snorlax joke by marketing an eBay listing of a Snorlax plush to his many fans. The plush was signed by Barbara and was commanding $200. On June 29, 2013, Chris tweeted out a message to Cole. The tweet stated that Cole should be helping Chris put bandages on their mom's, quote, holy buttocks. Chris later elaborated on what this meant, stating, quote, "My mother stresses me out with her continuous rants about her damn miniature scaby flies, her suffering, the low finances, and shit." Which confirms that his mother was being eaten alive by mites. Pretty ironic considering what happened to her husband and some insects. It probably would have been a good idea for Chris to not share this much information because not only is it gross, it is pretty personal. Moving on to her mental acuity, it appears that she may suffer from dementia, though this is unconfirmed, so take this as you will. Her appearances in videos from recent years paint a pretty grim image. She struggles to form coherent sentences. However, there are other videos that show her being a touch more alert and discussing her finances normally. So it does leave room for questioning. Maybe she's telling the truth, maybe she's not. Again, this is all still speculation. If her mind is going, perhaps that is a major part in what allowed the events of 2021 to transpire, as Chris mentioned that Barbara seemed partially confused during one of their get-togethers. He also stated in the 2021 logs that, quote, "She has had memory problems at time beforehand, but she is getting better stimulated in her mind and soul, and it really shows. Her mental processing speed is even going back up." He was really trying to suggest porking his own mother was healing her. Simply vile. The hospital evaluation after the arrest deemed her able to return home, which was quite shocking. The bar really shouldn't be that low for someone who clearly shows signs that they're just not ready to go home. You can look at her and tell that she's not all there. We know Barb has been at the house because of unfunny weens that have visited her and recorded her without her knowledge. She seems unsure of them, confused by everything, like a deer in headlights. In my opinion, she should not be bothered by anybody and needs to be looked after by somebody who can properly care for her. Her return to the house was not an open invitation for idiots to come and bother her. Based off of one of the visits, it appears her hearing is going as well. Her hearing was noted as having worsened by the 2014 pepper spray court hearing. According to Marvin, who was present at the hearing, he said, quote, "After a bit, the PD went up to the judge and they called Chris up. Chris starts getting impatient with Barb. He said something like, 'Are your ears clogged up?' And then, 'Want to follow me so you can hear what's going on?' Then she got up and trundled up there to accompany Chris. So if her hearing was bad nearly 10 years ago, it has to be shot by the beginning of the 2020s. By the time Chris was breaching the boundaries of his relationship with his own mother, she was already way far gone. Her story started out simple, just a basic beginning to what would have likely been a normal life had certain things been nudged in a different direction. She has lived quite a long time, experienced a lot, done plenty. While perhaps she could have been a better mother and a better wife, we only know a fraction of her entire story. What we do know doesn't exactly paint the prettiest of pictures, and I'd argue that despite her abusive nature, she definitely doesn't deserve the outcome she's received. Barb is a complicated person with a complicated past, and ultimately she would help mesh Chris into the character he is today. She, without even realizing it, helped create one of the most documented people in human history. If you're going to take anything away from this video, I hope it is that she should be kept away from people. Nobody should be bothering bothering her, period. She has done plenty of unpleasant things, she made plenty of bad choices, but nobody deserves this kind of fate. Perhaps soon she could be properly looked after with the days that she has left, and hopefully she can be at peace, away from her son. But unfortunately, that's going to be the end for today's video. If you like what I do, leave a comment, rate, and subscribe. If you want to support me in a more personal way, you can check out the Patreon link in the Teespring link in the description. I've got more content coming down the pipeline. But until then, I'll see you degenerates next time.